Hi everyone, I'm Glenn Diesen and I'm joined today by Alexander Mercouris and Ian Proud, who is, has been a member of the British Diplomatic Service from 99 to 2023. He's also served at the British Embassy in Moscow between 2014 and 19. And I would add also a prolific analyst and a writer who appear almost everywhere these days, it seems. So it's really great to have the both of you back.
Thanks so much, Glenn, and nice to join you both again.
Well, our topic today, though, is that of Georgia and Moldova and their elections, because I think there's a lot of parallels to be drawn to Ukraine. Indeed, I published a book back in 2014 where I addressed the failure of constructing a common European security system after the Cold War, and
Yeah,
by instead expanding exclusive blocks, be it both NATO and the EU. So my conclusion was simply then that we were reviving this Cold War logic. But instead of fighting for influence in the third world, we would fight more over where to draw the new dividing lines in Europe. And the problematic issue, of course, being European integration now entails decoupling from Russia, which is the largest state in Europe, and pursuing a very pro-NATO EU policy and anti-Russian one. So this continuation of bloc politics would then also be continue under often the guise of liberal democracy, but it wouldn't always coincide. And I think this is especially true in the common neighborhood, be it Ukraine, Georgia, Moldova, and I guess you can even put Belarus into the same category. That is, once you're entering the immediate border of Russia, it becomes an issue of international security. But in addition, one has to also be honest that these societies are deeply divided. And if you ask them to choose between East and West, it would be very easy to destabilize these societies. And indeed, integrating into either the West or towards Russia would most likely be a very undemocratic process, possibly sparking civil war or even a proxy war. And this is indeed what the CIA Director Burns concluded in 2008 would happen by pulling Ukraine into the NATO orbit. And I concluded that this could also happen in Georgia and Moldova. So I guess here we are today, and the social experiment to some extent have been run because we now had these elections in Georgia and Moldova, different outcomes, but still the reactions by us in the West has been quite remarkable.
predictable.
So I thought we could start, of course, comparing them, but perhaps we could start with Georgia, given that the violence is playing there. And I guess we could start with you, Ian. Could you give us an overview? Because it's something you cover extensively,
Yeah,
both as a diplomat and
I
as a
mean,
writer.
briefly stepping back to Belarus for a moment, in the context of your very helpful book from 2014. Actually, Belarus was making some quite small but nevertheless positive steps towards opening up its economic relationships, with Europe at the time that I was based in Moscow, and that was, it was very small, snail's pace, but nevertheless, quite positive, whilst also maintaining sort of good relations with Russia, with whom it has this kind of Commonwealth arrangement in terms of its kind of monetary policy and that sort of thing. But actually, the big blockage, as actually happened in Ukraine, was the EU kind of the customs union itself, which, if you choose to sort of buy into that and eventually sort of become members, that makes it much harder for you then to have open economic relationships with other kind of Eurasian countries, obviously in this context, in the former Soviet Union. And that's the very same issue which actually caused the splintering, within Ukraine that we see with tragic sort of consequences today, on the battlefield. This idea that if, by one day, maybe in 20 years' time, if you're to believe kind of Radek Sikorski and Emmanuel Macron, it might join, but have to make a cardinal choice and cut off economic relations with all the countries to its east, which is a completely sort of crazy position to put any small and vulnerable and developing country in. Now, fast forward that to kind of Georgia, of course, recently, but also actually exactly the same thing, applies in Moldova. Georgia signed its deep and comprehensive free trade agreement in 2014. That was implemented in 2016, with the EU. It has lost out, in its trading relations with the EU as the bigger Western European countries like Germany, France, and so on have profited, and their trading surpluses with Georgia have grown as the EU writ large has imposed all sorts of investigative trade protection measures, on Georgian imports. So Georgian sort of exports to Europe have practically not changed at all over the past decade, whereas kind of European exports have grown. And so, this idea that actually, the elections, a general election, was really about some sort of European choice. It's a false choice. What is the European Union actually offering Georgia beyond widespread and disruptive change to its culture, its kind of political system, and actually, its political settlement, in the context of an election where most people have chosen one party, which happens to be a party that kind of European leaders don't prefer. And that is just remarkable that European leaders should be, and actually supported by the Americans, of course, as happened obviously in Ukraine and to a lesser extent in Moldova, sort of egging them on, egging the protest movements on. It's quite an astounding situation that small but emerging country finds itself in.
I'm glad you bring this point up, because again, I remember what happened when back in 2013, Yanukovych suspended ratification of the association agreement with the EU, which is very controversial in Ukraine. And I spent a huge amount of time running through it, and I could see why it might be controversial, because of course it required Ukraine to convert completely to complete many of its standards to conform with European standards, and to adopt much of the EU's acquis, its laws, into basically Ukrainian laws. So it would be very difficult for Ukraine to do, and very economically problematic for Ukraine to do. So he suspended ratification. He said, we've got trading links with the Russians we need to preserve. The Russians are concerned about this. And, you may not like the Russians, but they did have a very strong economic and trade footprint in Ukraine, which was very important for much of the Ukrainian economy. Anyway, he did that. He said, I want discussions with the Russians, and I'm going to suspend this until, we can find a way through to iron these problems out. The reaction, as I remember, in Brussels and in the European capitals was completely hysterical. I mean, they were absolutely furious. They said that they would not, as I remember, they would not change a single punctuation mark in the EU association agreement. And of course, that eventually led to the crisis. All sorts of European dignitaries came and supported the protesters on Maidan Square. It was all represented as being part of Ukraine's European choice. It called itself, the protest movement in Kiev called itself Euro Maidan. And well, we've come to the position that we are in today. And it seems exactly the same all over again in Georgia and in Moldova. Absolutely nothing has been learned from the previous episode. It's always, you must do it the way we want to do it. This is the way that you join civilization. This is the way that you become, modern, a proper European country, which axiomatically is what you must want to do. And if it's not, if you don't do it, it's because you don't have agency here. It's because of some malevolent Russian influence that is somehow preventing you, which wasn't true in Ukraine. It's certainly not true in Georgia. As I understand it, Georgia still doesn't have diplomatic relations with Russia. So, which must, at some level, make it difficult for the Russians and the Georgian authorities to coordinate with each other. So, and I've seen no evidence of that. But there never seems to be any willingness to look at this, to say to yourself, well, look, is this that we are pressing on these people, on these small countries, these vulnerable and fragile countries, something which really is consistent with our own interests. And, when they say, well, slow down, because that's what the Georgians are saying at the moment. They're just saying, slow down. We want to think about this. We did this agreement with you. We until a few short time ago, they were wanting to adopt more of our standards and all of those things. But we do have our concerns. We do have our needs. Well, this isn't something that's acceptable if we are going to pass an NGO law. And of course, anybody who's been to Georgia knows about NGOs. My brother goes there regularly, by the way, and the role that they have.
It's just like a whole industry, isn't it?
It is,
Georgia,
exactly.
of Western-funded NGOs, and of course, Russia introduced its foreign agents laws. People have just extrapolated from that and said, well, Georgia is trying to do exactly the same thing as Russia. Ergo, Georgia is becoming a puppet state of Russia, which is completely nonsense. I mean, the NGO community is taken over, driving all sorts of agendas. I'm not necessarily saying they're bad agendas. I like diversity and inclusion and all those good things, but I live in England, and that's important to me. We're trying to force these things, on the sort of unsuspecting Georgian public is not necessarily helpful. I mean, the European dream is broken up into two bits, right? There's the economic bit, and then there's a political bit, right? Now, if you take Ukraine wants the economic bits, but Europe will never offer that, because actually fully sort of accommodating Ukraine within the European Union on the same status as existing members would bankrupt, the EU budget, would take away billions of subsidies from French farmers, from Polish farmers, cohesion funds from the Czechs, Slovaks, and many others. It would completely redraw the EU budgetary map such that it would drive the types of social cohesion we're already seeing in France, in Germany, and in other places in the context of this ridiculous war sort of in Ukraine. So the EU will, even though they'll never say it, they will never let Ukraine in on the same economic sort of beneficial terms as existing member states. On the political side, Ukraine can't deliver the political reforms necessary. It remains too corrupted and unreformed from its kind of post-Soviet sort of transition, which has made very, very little progress over the space of 33 years. And this European dream is only kind of stalling efforts to do so. There's no evidence that Zelensky is any less corrupt than any of the corrupt leaders that, frankly, came, before him. The whole war effort is just a massive gravy train of embezzlement, and thievery. And now you take that into Georgia. Actually, politically, Georgia has actually made some quite positive steps. Whether you like the Georgia Dream Party or not, I'm not Georgian. I don't get to vote. But actually, they have made some positive kind of reforms, and changes there. It's now a sort of high on the World Bank ease of doing business index. It's far outperformed other South Caucasian, Central Asian, and Eastern European states in terms of the reforms it has been making. And actually, despite the kind of the protestations of the senior French diplomat who's currently the president and wants to stay on after her term has expired, in Georgia, most observers looked at the elections that took place and said, well, on balance, they were by the standards of Eastern European elections fairly fair, with some minor violations kind of here or there. So I mean, Georgia is not necessarily a model political state, but nevertheless, it has been reforming and it has been improving, and its economic track record, has been quite good. This, to me, can, again, reminds me of the need, rather than fixating on some idea of choosing to join some non-existent, frankly, European economic space, because the Europeans have never let anybody in on the sort of terms existing members have, but actually to create a much bigger Eurasian political and economic space where the EU economically, but also with a small p politically, coexists with wider Eurasia and actually generates mutually beneficial trade and political relationships that way around, rather than the choose us rather than Russia approach, which has had absolutely disastrous consequences over the past decade.
We often speak about narratives on this channel, and I think this is the problem, because once you revive this Cold War logic of you have to be either this side or that side of the dividing lines, the narratives have to be dumbed down as well. And it's again, this is something with similarities to Ukraine, because I remember back in 2013-14, we said, oh, Yanukovych is pro-Russian, these are pro-European. You had people like Carl Bildt coming out saying this is civilizational choice, so very similar as what you're seeing now. But Yanukovych, the reason he was reaching out to the EU is they wanted to be a bridge. They wanted to integrate with both sides. I mean, even Belarus, which is the closest one to Russia now, they still want to diversify. They don't want excessive dependence only on Russia. So they want, some with the Europeans, some with Russia, some with China, and some with Africa. But again, we kind of already want the same thing, but they don't want to end up choosing. And I think this is what is so strange for me, because we see the same thing play out in Georgia. That is, everything is this binary choice. Do you want freedom or tyranny? And if you buy into this premise, then if you see people protesting and news anchors say, well, the government are puppets of Putin, then okay, well, now anything is legitimate. Now you can demand new elections, you can sanction them, you can incite riots. We even saw NATO Secretary General come out and said that, it was unacceptable for Georgia to move away from its path towards the EU and NATO, because this is democracy, and you can't move away from this. So this only makes sense if you buy into this idea that anyone who's marching is for democracy, and anyone who might set up their own, conditions. And
And can I just say that nobody ever elected the head of NATO? Yeah.
No,
he's as democratically unaccountable as Ursula von der Leyen, frankly, and the other 5 presidents, of Europe. This is not a Democrat telling, Georgians what to do. And what's it got to do with NATO anyway? Isn't this about sort of the European dream, such that it is? It's quite remarkable. I mean, that NATO should just stay out of these conversations altogether, because that just always seems to make things worse, and always kind of encourages, not that Russia necessarily wants to get involved, it has far more things to deal with right now, but always encourages a kind of a Russian response.
But it's just this, my point is, it's just terrifying how simple it is to win over the public. All you have to do is show on the screen some people marching, refer to government as being Putin puppets, and everyone suddenly seems to be on board on toppling a democratically elected government. And it's just very obvious that this is not about values. This is about Cold War politics. You want them to align.
That's because we don't have free and open media in the UK. Watching the BBC is a bit like watching Russia Сегодня, possibly even more biased than that. So the availability of independent news and analysis is in the UK, actually, unlike in the US, where it's much more sort of open, I find, extremely, extremely limited. And it agrees with me to say that. And that's why I'm glad that you both kind of, had discussions such as this.
Mm-hmm. I just wanted to bring up this point that you made about Eurasia and about Eurasian economic trading systems, and that the EU could actually fit into that quite well, and that would make things much less tense in places like Georgia, Moldova. Indeed, once upon a time, Ukraine, though I think we're past that point in Ukraine now, sadly. I can very clearly remember I've only seen Putin in the flesh on 2 occasions, both of them at SPIEF in St. Petersburg, with a vast hall, big plenary session. And I think it was in 2016, and he did this long speech there, went on for about an hour, talking about very much the sort of things that you've just talked about, developing, building up Eurasia. He talked about a greater Eurasia project that Russia was building all these economic linkages with China at that time, which of course not anywhere near as developed as they are now, but he was talking about them then. And he was talking about how the Europeans would be very welcome, and it'd be excellent if they could participate. Now, the big foreign guest at that meeting was Matteo Renzi, who was the
I was there. I was in the same big hall that you. We could have met for coffee.
Well,
I remember very well.
Well, you will then remember that Putin was saying all of those things, and then Matteo Renzi said absolutely nothing. It was as if Putin had been talking into the wind. I mean, he never mentioned or discussed any of these things that Putin had been talking about. And I did think that you've come to Russia. Are you even listening to what the Russians are saying? If you don't agree, say you don't agree. You think that the European Union is doing very well by itself, and we don't really need to do all of this. But it was as if Putin was talking into the wind. It was very strange. It was as if Renzi simply wasn't taking any of what Putin was saying at all seriously.
I remember him waffling on at great and poetic length about what a fabulous city St. Petersburg was, and trying to avoid talk about Ukraine at all costs, and not much else.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, in fact, if you remember, he even said at the beginning that he wasn't going to speak from his prepared speech. He was going to extemporize because he was so overwhelmed by emotion at being in this wonderful city and all of that.
And wonderful it is.
And wonderful it is. But this is so characteristic of Western, or at least European leaders, I think, in that they don't seem to take seriously or listen at all to what the other side is saying. And this must be very, very frustrating for the Russians. I think it must have been very frustrating for the Russians in that hall where they were. And it continues since, because we see this in Georgia. We see this play out in Moldova. Huge effort to try and get this referendum, across the line, big vote to join the EU, massive support for the president of Moldova, all kinds of claims of Russian influence, buying votes, all of that sort of thing in Moldova, of which there was, no evidence has ever appeared, at least not that I'm aware of, not since the election. In fact, now that she's re-elected, the whole narrative seems to have been quietly
and
forgotten.
Yet the votes that swayed her election were votes from outside of Moldova, the kind of Western living sort of diaspora, in the context of there only being 2 voting booths allowed in the whole of Russia for Moldovans, to vote.
So
but there we go. Election meddling. I think it's a Brussels possibly election meddling.
So the question I'm going to ask is, is this straightforward cynicism? Is this a very cynical geopolitical project now, or is there still some kind of idealistic momentum behind this? When they do these things, are they basically intentionally setting up an anti-Russian bloc, or do they really believe that what they're doing is somehow in the interests of the people that they're inflicting all these things on?
I think the narrative has been so strong for so long that people have just bought into it unquestioningly. European leaders, people like Guy Verhofstadt, who was on the stage in the Maidan at the back end of 2013, completely barking mad, and people have just bought into this. I don't even think it's ideology. People have become over-convinced about the kind of virtues of the European project. And I'm pro-European, don't get me wrong. I think it's achieved tremendous things, frankly, since the end of the devastating Second World War. But we're starting to see, in the context of the war in Ukraine, that it also has some quite deep fissures, and actually risks, if it continues on this kind of ever-centralizing, ever-politicizing route that Ursula von der Leyen has taken it on, imploding one day. Because actually, existing member states, not even thinking about the Ukrainians and the Georgians and the Moldovas, existing member states worry about the ever-creeping loss of their own sovereignty and say, well, actually, we'd far sooner govern ourselves, thank you very much, and we'll leave. And I think that's a real risk in France more than in any other country, even, compared to, for example, Hungary. So, I think, the Europeans need to get back to the basics of what made them a success in the first place. And that was kind of breaking down barriers through commerce so that people could interact more freely, and to quit this drive to kind of over-centralize and try to turn sort of peripheral countries into kind of smaller mini-me, virtuous versions of themselves.
But it's well, before Alexander mentioned we don't listen to the other side, the Russians. But again, the same applies to the Georgians, because they actually do want to join. they actually want to be close to the EU. They want all of this, much like the Ukrainians said in 2013. But much like them, they're just saying, listen, we live on the border of Russia. We can't be anti-Russian. We can't be on the front line against Russia. We would like to be pro both, and they're learning that this is not an option. But I want to ask about Moldova, because this is, when we say we stand with the people of Georgia, it means, toppling their government. But when we stand with the people of Moldova, it has a different meaning, because there, of course, we got not our guy, but our woman in, or, we're on the side of the government. But if you criticize the democratic credential of the election in Georgia, I mean, it's not comparable to what happened really in Moldova. As you mentioned, within Moldova, the majority did not vote for Sandu. Indeed, she relied on the vote from abroad, and from abroad we mean the West. You pointed out that there's only 2 polling stations in Russia for Moldovans, and this is where most Moldovans live abroad. That's Russia. That's number 1 destination, and they're overwhelmingly very favorable of Russia. Meanwhile, in Italy, I think there's 60 polling. Why? Why would there be 30 times as many? And of course, Transnistria, they were supposed to be able to vote.
Well, they had to travel to, even though Moldova insists that Transnistria is a part of the state of Moldova as a country, people who lived in that part of Moldova, as they see it, had to travel across the border into the unoccupied or unfrozen, if you like, part of Moldova. I mean, it's completely ridiculous, and blatant and cynical, I think, to pick up on Alexander's words from a moment ago. Just have an election, but make it free and fair. Let people vote where they want. Overseas polling stations should be made available. Apparently up to 150,000 Moldovan people live in Russia more than in any other country, I believe. But, people feel free to correct me if that's incorrect. But I mean, 150,000 people and 2 polling booths, you don't need to be a mathematics genius to realize that will present logistical challenges. And you saw, even if they were sponsored by the Russian state, you saw these kind of rather theatrical kind of parades of people with Moldovan flags in Moscow, protesting about these limitations. But to me, it just seemed like an own goal, a ridiculous own goal. And there's no responsibility or accountability in Moldova itself, but also in Europe, which kind of really pulling the strings on all this about sort of how warping sort of this type of behavior is. If you talk about democratic freedoms, criticize other countries for democratic backsliding, well, then ensure that sort of democratic elections take place in as free and as fair a way as possible.
Well, indeed, because one of the effects of this is it's going to weaken the legitimacy of the government of Moldova. I mean, people in Moldova will know perfectly well what happened. I mean, I think this is another thing where people get this very wrong, is that I think that they consistently underestimate the understanding of events that people in these countries have. You see people in Moldova, you may think that they look poor, which they are, that, they live in conditions which we don't have in the West. But that doesn't mean that they don't understand these things. And they know perfectly well that Sandu is not supported by most of the people who live in Moldova. And yes, it's entirely proper that a diaspora should be entitled to vote in elections. It happens in many countries. It happens in Greece. I am Greek. I actually don't vote in Greek elections, as it happens, but that's my choice. I absolutely accept the right of people who don't live in Moldova, but who are Moldovans, to participate in Moldovan elections. But having a situation where some are entitled to, but others are not, simply because of geography and the place where they happen to live, is, again, deeply manipulative. And people in Moldova will understand that. So as a result of what has happened, yes, Sandu is still president, but there is a political cost in that her legitimacy has been weakened. And given what is happening across the border in Ukraine, what we see there, that really ought to be something that ought to be of greater concern than it appears to be.
Yeah, exactly. And what's really interesting, I think, for me about the Moldova election is actually the Russian-speaking sort of community, within Moldova, including within Transnistria itself, is now in quite a significant minority, within Moldova. But nevertheless, the proportion of people living in Moldova who wanted to have balanced relations, both, with Europe, of course, but also with Russia, was actually significant. So it's not just the kind of Russian-speaking sort of communities within Moldova that actually want a balanced relationship where Moldova can prosper by engaging with whomsoever it wishes, but it's kind of Moldovan-speaking, Romanian-speaking sort of people too. And I found that actually really fascinating in terms of looking at the electoral data.
No.
But it's I like what you said about getting back to basics, though, because again, for the 90s and early 2000s was like the golden era of the EU, because all these countries, they really wanted to join the EU, and in order to do so, the EU could put conditions in terms of having, some democratic reforms, and it could be a force for good as it wanted to be. But now, this attempt for regime change, toppling a democratic elected government in Georgia, which might even result in war, like it happened in Ukraine, or now in this very, let's say it's fraudulent election in Moldova. But not only fraudulent, but it's also deeply problematic, because when you have pockets of the population which is very, very different from others, it can be very destabilizing. For example, in this region of Gagauzia, I think it was 95% of voters voted against the EU. I mean, how and they sit there. They, in our media, of course, they can just explain that this is democracy versus tyranny, democracy won, but the people living there, they know what's happening, and you're gonna get a region where 95% don't want this, and you're gonna, through fraud, pull them in to the EU. I mean,
and the Gagauz people are actually Russian speaking, but they're ethnically distinct. They don't see themselves as Russian people. They just happen to be kind of Russian speaking. That's their lingua kind of franca. So people in Brussels can't even label them as kind of being Russians. They just happen to speak Russian. But as you say, the majority of them, the vast majority of them, say, well, actually, no, they kind of having a balanced approach, must be better for our country. Of course, Gagauzia was right in the heart of the kind of the games in the 19th century. Of course, that people like Tolstoy kind of and others wrote about prelude to the first Crimean War. Let's put it that way. So over the centuries, that whole region has seen kind of the ebb and flow of conquests and so on. Understandably, as a country with only about 4 million inhabitants, they want to just live in peace and prosperity with all of their neighbours, and who wouldn't want that?
Can I pivot to the Ukrainian conflict, about which you have written extremely thoroughly and very well? Because I am moderately, slightly hopeful that we are now finally exiting this long, dark period when there was a conflict and we weren't talking to the Russians at all. Biden wouldn't talk to Putin. Our prime ministers wouldn't talk to Putin. The Germans wouldn't talk to Putin. The French wouldn't talk to Putin. No diplomatic contacts to speak of. Now we have the United States. They've appointed, the new administration is going to appoint an envoy, General Kellogg. Many views about him, but he's going to at least presumably go to Moscow at some point, speak to the Russians. At least that, it seems to me, is movement. But again, I wonder, and this is what my concern is, are people, even as talk about negotiations is beginning, are they listening at all to what the Russians are saying? Because again, I feel a little bit like it was with, Renzi back in 2016. The Russians have said all sorts of things. Putin spoke at the foreign ministry back in June. He set out various conditions there. You might agree with them. You might think that you can find ways around them. You might want to think all sorts of things. But the point is, you should at least listen to what he is saying. And instead, I don't get the impression we are. We seem to be doing what a friend of mine said. We're spending all our time negotiating and debating peace plans with each other
in isolation,
in a vacuum, forgetting that this isn't, there is another side.
The latest, maybe there could be German peacekeepers that came out. Was it yesterday or the day before? On the back of Boris Johnson's deeply unhelpful suggestion of British peacekeepers, not recognizing the fact that any NATO sort of troops on Ukrainian soil would obviously be a Russian red line. So yeah, I mean, we come up with all these amazing ideas, all these kind of desperately intelligent people who've got us into this mess in the first place. Actually, we just need to kind of have a negotiation with both parties to the conflict, which is Ukraine. Obviously, Zelensky has made illegal any negotiation with Russia and Russia. There's nothing complicated about this. Peace talks take place between the parties to the conflict, and we can't ignore Russia forever. And of course, the longer we go, I mean, almost 3 years now, the worse the situation gets for Ukraine. The more indebted it becomes, the more people it loses, creepingly kind of, kilometer by kilometer, small additional sort of bits of Donetsk fall to the ongoing sort of Russian, advance. Gradually, kind of Western support for supplies dries up. Actual freebies have been replaced with loans, which are just making over time Ukraine more indebted than it already is. Zelensky's unconstitutional mandate continues. Of course, for him, if war ends, then he has to face elections and probably be replaced by his former head of the military, who now resides probably quite close to you, Alexander, somewhere in London. So, none of the numbers look good, for Ukraine the longer that we wait. And so I think the Kellogg thing, I mean, he wrote a very good piece, slightly kind of slightly obsequious, with the Trump audience in mind piece, but nevertheless, I thought quite a good piece, in April about how the Biden administration has so catastrophically sort of got, the situation badly wrong, in Ukraine, and therefore essentially kind of, helped to precipitate this disastrous war. I get the impression that, he's a pragmatist, and he won't sort of side with the kind of head in the sand merchants who think that, well, if we just keep our bottoms facing towards Putin, everything will be okay one day. I think he is a pragmatist. Everything that Trump said indicates that he is too. Obviously, Vance has been, I think, quite coherent in terms of what he has said, on this conflict. I hope that common sense will start to prevail. The talks will be tough. I mean, Russia's hand is stronger now, frankly, than it was in March 2022. But it's only going to get worse the longer we delay this. And so, I wish him well and fair speed to Moscow as soon as he can, quite frankly, because we really need these negotiations to start.
You mentioned, that they don't discuss Russia's concerns, and I saw it was a piece, well, maybe it was today or yesterday in the Wall Street Journal, when there was some American official pointed out that they needed a sustainable peace that was acceptable to the United States and Ukraine, and I thought the same. Where does Russia fit in? Like, where is its security interest? But this is a wider problem, because during the Cold War, of course, you can say, well, what are the Soviets worried about? What is the West worried about? And then you can start to talk about how to mitigate each other's security concerns. But since over the past decades now, I can't remember a single time I've opened a newspaper or watched the TV where we discuss, well, what are the Russian security concerns? Indeed, discussing Russian security concerns seems to be some admission that perhaps, NATO is not simply a force for good and a defensive alliance. It might actually threaten Russia. And this has become almost, something for heretics. Again, we can censor it by referring to it as Russian talking points, or whatever we say to cancel or censor people. But this is
repeating really historical grievances, the same old phrases that come out of the kind of Whitehall kind of script every time they ignore. But I mean, the thing is, Russia's security concerns are quite simple and have been clearly articulated at least since 2008, and actually arguably since 2006. So at least for 18 years now, about NATO expansion. There's nothing more complicated or difficult to understand than that. And that has always been the issue, the casus belli of where we are, today. And we just have to sort of finally have a reckoning with this mother of all elephants in the room, that actually kind of Russia, under no circumstances, will accept a situation in which Ukraine joins NATO. And for Zelensky now to kind of start talking about, well, okay, he'll accept some partition, but only if the rest of Ukraine, is included within NATO. It's, illegally, as he himself, in fairness, pointed out during his interview, it's just clearly deluded, because that is never going to wash. We just have to have a reckoning with this in circumstances where Ukraine can also feel satisfied that it does have some sort of security guarantees, that there are kind of arrangements in place to prevent the possibility, if it has neutrality, and some form of demilitarization, that it wouldn't be subject to further attack, and if it would, there would be an appropriate response, from the wider world. It's really as simple as that.
Why do we find it so difficult to listen to what others say, the Russians say, the Georgians, the Moldovans, all of these people? All right, I accept in Georgia and Moldova, we will also find people who are close to our way of thinking. They're the people who are protesting. They're the people who are voting for Sandu. One shouldn't ignore them or pretend that they're not there. They clearly are there. But the fact is that there are an awful lot of people who think differently, and they have a point of view, and they're entitled to express it, and they have agency as well. The Russians obviously have agency. They have very, very powerful agency. Why do we continue to think that their opinions are things which we can disregard? And I have to say, the thing that really, this, I'm sure you're aware of this extraordinary comment by Mark Rutte that it isn't the right moment for Ukraine to negotiate. We've got to give Ukraine more weapons and more support so that it wins its way back to some kind of position of advantage in the negotiations, which is, of course, no different from what we've been doing for the last 3 years, with the result we've all seen. But again, what that almost says is we don't really want to talk to the other side. We don't want to address their concerns, their views, their worries, their fears. We want, essentially, it has to be our way or the highway. We are the people. The only outcome, the only negotiation, the only acceptable outcome to a negotiation is one where we dictate the terms. This isn't.
But our way has failed.
Yeah.
Catastrophically failed. Yeah. It failed in 2014. It failed, 2021 after Biden came to power and reinstated Jake Sullivan, Victoria Nuland, Anthony Blinken, who was a deputy national security advisor, under the Obama administration, when the kind of Maidan sort of revolution was all kind of, bubbling up, bringing in all these hawks, going back to the same old script that they've been using back in 2014. Sort of, saying, well, let's not have any truck, with Putin's concerns about sort of NATO enlargement, and just carry on regardless, after a period of relative stability, actually, I'm not necessarily praising the previous Trump administration, but a period of relative stability on that sort of line of contact in the Donbass, at least, and some sort of low level, but so, Putin and Trump have met and that sort of thing, engagement sort of taking place, a sudden ramping up, to the point where, Ukraine felt backed up enough to sort of essentially declare the Minsk agreement, the second Minsk agreement, to be dead in the water, and with the results that we see today. It's an absolutely kind of failed policy, and it has been for a decade. Why don't we listen to kind of Russian concerns? I think the truth is, it's quite a visceral thing. We hate the fact that actually we have failed. It hurts at quite a deep level that politicians, like Philip Hammond, like Liz Truss, like Boris Johnson, like obviously kind of Biden, the functionaries like Sullivan and Newland, dreadful, dreadful human beings. Frankly, in my view, that's just a personal opinion, not a professional one. Have failed, and it hurts them. And I think that's why we don't want to listen, because all this talk about, well, we just give Ukraine a few more weapons to get them into a better position. They're losing ground every day on the battlefield. How many more weapons do we need to give them before we realize that actually they're losing? And, that's not going to change until the war comes to an end. So it's that deep sense of hurt and bitterness that somehow Putin's got one over on us because we couldn't organize ourselves well enough and marshal the resources sufficiently to kind of win the day through force, which is what we wanted all along. There we go.
Can I just suggest something further, though, which is that, again, and I want to just mention in this program your book, A Misfit in Moscow, and it's an absolutely wonderful book which describes the work of the embassy, the British embassy in Moscow. And this very fascinating thing that I found reading it, the thing that really stays with me, which is that you were one of the very few diplomats who actually went out of the embassy on a systematic basis and met with Russian officials. You have obviously not always the easiest people to speak to and get on with, but I mean, you did. And eventually you found that there was a way you could develop a dialogue with them. You could understand them. They would put their bombast to one side, and you'd find a way.
And ours.
And ours, exactly, absolutely. And of course, what happens is that so many of the others in the embassy did not, and they were all spending their time doing their research, presumably copying each other and looking at the newspapers
or video calls to London.
Video calls to London, doing their analysis, as they called that this practice of talking to ourselves rather than to the other side has actually very deep roots indeed. And obviously you're talking about the British Foreign Office, and it's clear that other foreign ministries in Europe were better organized in some respects than ours was. I mean, one doesn't want to say too much there, but I wonder whether this isn't actually a more pervasive problem than one that goes beyond us. We find it easier to talk to ourselves than to do the difficult thing of leaving the embassy or the trade mission or whatever.
Yeah, that's completely right. We certainly in Moscow, I don't necessarily include myself in the royal we, but diplomats tended to kind of hang out with the Americans. The Germans, the French, the G8, also G7 kind of embassies and that sort of thing, and that's it. The European Commission office. I remember once at a sort of social gathering, somebody mentioned a really good first secretary of the Filipino embassy, and people looked at this person and said, "Why the heck are you recommending that person?" As if this is not the sort of person we'd normally talk to. We normally talk to our kind of Western club, the Americans, the Europeans, and that's it. So it's odd, but I completely agree. And actually, I also kind of liken it slightly to Toy Story. I mean, the cartoon movie kind of Toy Story. There's that. We're all desperate to kind of get close to the mothership of the U.S. embassy, and sort of hear chapter and verse from them. There's that group of cartoon characters in Toy Story, and they're in this kind of they're in this machine with a kind of big yellow claw, from above, and they're all hoping that which I liken to the US, they're all hoping that they'll get picked and spoken to by the Americans. And I kind of liken it to that. You're all desperate to kind of hear from the Americans. And you saw that certainly in the policy making process. Any decision that we took on Ukraine policy, there had to be a filter through Victoria Nuland's office. We almost couldn't get up and breathe without having cross-checked through either the National Security Council in DC or through Victoria Nuland's office in in the State Department. And it's also this kind of complete inability to have an independent view and an independent UK position that is separate from where the Americans are.
Yeah, I find it often, well, that's almost a remnant of the unipolar era, because it's not just about economics, it's also about, again, the expectation that the rest of the world will abide by your narrative. And it's I remember back in 2013 when we had this struggle over Ukraine, and at that time the Russians were pointing out, why you have revived this zero-sum logic of us versus them, and effectively the response by the EU then was, well, it's not that the institutions are zero-sum, that Ukraine has to choose between us or them, by definition zero-sum. It was Russia had a zero-sum mentality. It just had to overcome this and accept that this is going to be great for everyone. And this is, I think this is why it's becoming, accepting the arguments of the opponent is seen almost as a defeat, a surrender, that somehow you have to give up this idea of your altruism, that you will be a benign hegemon, that the opponent has this competing security interests. But again, for the EU especially, who envisions that it will rise above power politics altogether, to start to accept that the security is about harmonizing competing security interests, and we have a security dilemma. All of this, I think they're very reluctant to accept it, simply because it goes against the whole ideology of what they're built around. But I'm interested in this idea.
But it also still goes back to the economics, because as we see today with what's happening in the German economy, it makes no sense at all to have a complete economic rupturing between Europe and Russia. In Riccardo's, comparative advantage, why wouldn't we want to have, really close kind of trading links with this vast country with its enormous kind of mineral resources that can power our factories in Germany? The Volkswagen factories had all been progressively kind of shut down. Why are we making sort of economic choices through a political lens? Why does it make sense for Europe to buy liquefied natural gas from the US at 30-40% price hike up compared to kind of piped Russian gas, from Russia, setting aside the fact that the Americans, the Ukrainians blew up Nord Stream, but nevertheless, pipelines are still there. It makes no economic sense, at all to do this. And the Americans have absolutely kind of driven this rupturing, supported by, the UK over the past decade. And we're seeing catastrophic sort of political consequences in Germany, particularly now, given what's happening, with their economy, to a certain extent, in France too. But I think that's a slightly different dynamic to that situation. That is creating the conditions for our security, our collective security, to get worse. This feeling that our collective prosperity and well-being is being eroded by the political choices that are being made, not necessarily even here, but actually in the United States of America. I think we just need to get back to the basics of what made Europe successful in the first place, and think Eurasian, more. I know it can become a bit of a kind of a buzzword, sort of Eurasian multipolar, but I do think actually that we just need to kind of refocus in on how we can have genuinely mutually beneficial sort of relationships that improve relations with Russia, that allow Ukraine to emerge and rebuild itself stronger, and more prosperous, that allow Georgia and countries like Moldova to trade freely without picking, between whether they want to look west or whether they want to look east. It's a completely kind of false choice. We just need to get back to the basics here.
Absolutely, because of course good relations, or at least not maybe good relations, but stable relations with the Russians is the guarantee of the independence of all of these countries. If there is a peace which is stable in Europe, in which all the parties are equally invested, then of course that does provide scope and room for countries like Georgia, Ukraine, the Baltic states, all of the others, to find their way and to find their place, and to do so left basically to themselves. Peace is, I would have said, the precondition for achieving all of these things. If you continue into a situation of conflict with the Russians, like the one we have now, you are inevitably going to have tension in places like Georgia, Moldova, Armenia, wherever, because always in that kind of crisis, it's going to be a battle for influence between two adversary powers engaged in a proxy war with each other, power blocks. So we should absolutely aim for peace. And it's astonishing that this is so difficult for so many people to understand. And aiming for peace surely means taking into account what the other side is saying. I mean, we may not like them, we may not agree with them. We can, by the way, express our disagreement. And I think you will agree that the Russians actually, when we express disagreement, they're pretty straightforward people. They do listen. Yeah. I mean, it's not, there's no reason why we shouldn't express our disagreements with them. We can push back, we can do whatever we want, but at least we should listen and talk to them.
No, Russian interlocutors like a good argument. They like it. They like sort of a good negotiation. They like sort of searching for compromise. What they hate is being deliberately ignored, and having their interests ignored. I mean, I think that is absolutely clear. And diplomacy is not about friendship. I mean, great if you can have it. It's about coexistence. Exactly. That's what we're talking about. We don't all have to be friends. Biden doesn't have to like Putin, although Biden's going to be shuffling off to a retirement home, thankfully, anytime soon. It's not actually about friendship. It's about coexistence, and it's about respect. Respecting that you have priorities, but respecting the person that you're talking to has priorities as well, and trying to find a common ground so that you don't end up killing each other. In its simplest form.
Well, I'm probably finished for today, but Glenn.
No, just note, because if we go back to the 90s, when we were faced with these two possible framework of Europe, we can either have an inclusive security architecture where we take into account each other's security based on the principle of indivisible security, but we chose not to do this because we went with the EU and NATO as they were argued to be interdemocratic security institutions. That is, we argued the liberal democratic values were important. So yes, we exclude Russia from them, which can create some problems, but at least will elevate the role of democracy and human rights. However, we have to take some assessment to how is this going now, because of course in Ukraine we toppled a democratically elected government, which led to war. In Georgia we're trying to topple a government. In Moldova we stand by what can only be called a fraudulent election. In Azerbaijan, the EU is very happy to congratulate the election victory of over 90%, which also looks a bit dubious. In Armenia, we saw...
They need the gas.
Yeah, exactly. But in Armenian, when they had this ethnic cleansing of all the people in Nagorno-Karabakh who lived there for hundreds of years, I look in the media, it's like, this is bad for Putin. I mean, if the main principle here was our liberal democratic values, and we now have to throw it out in the name of this geopolitical struggles, maybe we should start to address why we have these geopolitical struggles, whether or not it was a good idea to try to create a Europe without the Russians, because I think in all this geopolitical struggle, all our so-called values are being used as weapons and thrown away. So at least if you're in Georgia now, what are you going to think about all our liberal democratic values? They're seen almost as a slogan, as a catchphrase, something to be weaponized. This is not great for anyone. This is...
as the Russian saying goes, "Деньги не пахнут," which means money doesn't smell. And that's a good thing about commerce, because you don't need to worry about whether you like the person who's buying the car or the loaf of bread or whatever from you. It's commerce, and you have a reason to kind of coexist. Yeah. All this stuff about values, I have values. I can't walk down my street without meeting people with different values to mine. The idea that there's some immutable set of pan-European values that unite us is a total fiction. we all live by a set of guiding principles. They should focus increasingly on the basics, like commerce and that sort of thing, and ditch all of this kind of woke stuff about sort of. I mean, I think inclusion is great, love inclusion, but I mean, actually, just focus on the basics. Let's get back to the basics and ditch all this kind of ridiculous, value stuff that tries to kind of alter the total kind of cultural identity and the political settlement of quite vulnerable countries in a massively disruptive way.
I'm going to go back on what I said. I'm going to ask you one last question. Are you mildly optimistic about the situation now, as I am, that we are moving away from this very, very unsustainable, ultra hardline position of not talking to the Russians at all, that the new administration looks like it wants to do this, and there's a general sense of exhaustion, at least I think there is, across Europe about this whole policy, and that through sheer weight of events, we're now being pushed forward, however unwillingly, into restarting a dialogue from which perhaps something good will come. I want to be optimistic. I just wondered what your feelings were.
I am optimistic. It's hard to imagine anything more catastrophic than the Biden administration. So anything must be an improvement. But I do think Kellogg is a pragmatist. Vance seems to have his head in a good place, and Trump wants to end the war, and I think that's what we should try to do. I'm less optimistic about the Middle East, I have to say. But when it comes to Russia and that sort of nexus, then yes, I am cautiously optimistic.
Mm-hmm.
Well, it's rarely we end on a positive note, so we'll just leave it there, as some optimism is good. So again, Ian Proud, thank you so much. Alexander, thank you.
And thank you both. Really nice to talk to you again.